Hello, this is Justin, and this video is a book review of The Lessons of History by Will and Ariel Durant. So I think this book is very important because it allows us to learn from history and learn from the past, and I think history is a lot more than just memorizing facts and dates, because history really shows us how the society we live in came about, and it sheds light on the society we live in by comparing it to the past and how we have progressed and maybe how we have regressed in some cases. Also, history teaches us of the historical patterns that often repeat themselves, and we can learn from the examples of the past, and it also gives us our cultural heritage that we are responsible for passing down to our descendants as our ancestors passed down to us. So I think history is a lot more than just facts and figures and dates. It's so much more than that, and like I mentioned before, it really sheds light on the world we live in, and I think that's why it's so important. So The Lessons of History is a book written in 1968. So it was published in 1968, and that means that when you're reading it, the references it makes when it's talking about the current times and modern times would maybe a little different from how things are right now, because times have changed since 1968. However, I think the book is still very relevant because a lot of things it talks about still shows us how society is even today, because a lot of things have not changed, and a lot of things that apply to the 1960s still show us how people saw the world and how society functioned then, and we could compare it to today. And when it goes back in time and goes to all the different periods of Western civilization, a lot of lessons we learn from that still applies to today as much as it applied to 1968. So I don't think this book is outdated at all, and it gives us a lot of wisdom that we could apply today, and it will continue to provide wisdom for future generations. So it uses examples from throughout the history of Western civilization, and like a sentence could begin in ancient times and it could end in modern times. It could start with medieval times and it could end with Renaissance, and it just spans the whole spectrum of Western civilization, which is something I really liked about the book, because I'm an avid historian and I love reading about examples from throughout history, and it really shows us how times have changed and also how societies function in different ways, and understanding how societies can function in different ways during different times really shows us how our society can function, and it sheds light on our own culture and gives us perspective. Also, if you're reading the book and you don't have a comprehensive knowledge of Western history, it could be a little difficult because it doesn't give a lot of background information or context when it mentions examples. So if you're not an expert with the history of Western civilization, when you're reading the book, you might end up Googling or looking up different dates and different examples and different events that the book brings up. But if you had a decent knowledge of the history of Western civilization from school, you would probably be alright. It doesn't go into very, very detailed examples. It covers a lot of different examples from throughout history, and if you went to school and you had a decent knowledge of Western civilization, you'd be fine. But even then, just the variety of examples they give might be a little difficult for people who are not experts in history. But if you are experts in history, you would love it, because you would probably know all the examples it mentions, and it doesn't go into very, very detailed specifics, so you'll still know what they're talking about even if you don't look things up. So I would advise people who really know history that this would be a great book, and you wouldn't even have to Google stuff because you wouldn't know what it's talking about. but for people who are not so well versed in Western civilization history, then it might be a little difficult to read without Googling stuff and looking up stuff. But I would still recommend you read it because it has a lot of very strong insights that are very thought-provoking, and a lot of it applies to the society we live in today, and it tells us how society is functioning and how we can learn that and compare that to the past. So, like I said, it focuses on the history of Western civilization, so it doesn't really cover other civilizations. And since Western civilization is so rich, there's still a lot of lessons to be learned and there's still a lot of wisdom to be gained, but unfortunately we don't get the full perspective by not looking at other civilizations, but you still learn a lot of lessons from the history of Western civilization alone. Also, it examines a lot of different elements that contribute to history. So there's most of the chapters cover a specific element of history. One would be geography, another would be war, another would be government, and another would be religion. So each chapter really breaks things down and really allows you to learn specifically about that element of history and how we can apply that to our society and how it sheds light on the world we live in today. So the book is very comprehensive with the variety of history and the examples it draws, and it really shows us, it compares different points of history, and I think that is very thought-provoking when you examine the specific arguments they make and the specific lessons and conclusions they draw from history. So I would definitely recommend you to read the book because it's very thought-provoking and you learn a lot about society and how society and civilization progresses and changes over time, and how culture changes and how cultures can be different, and it gives us perspective on our own culture. So the book ends with a discussion on the cyclical nature of civilizations, the fact that most civilizations rise and fall, and there's a cycle to it. There's a period where the civilization is rising and it's producing great art and architecture and inventions, it's conquering other areas, and then there's periods where it declines and it loses wealth, it falls into debt, and there's just a lot of problems that end up destroying the civilization. So you can think of ancient Rome, but specifically a lot of the arguments or a lot of the ideas they were talking about is how many authors were talking about the decline of Western civilization today. They talked about Oswald Spengler, I think his name was, and he wrote about the potential decline of Western civilization, and it compares it to the rise and falls of other civilizations. So I thought that was really interesting, and that was the second last chapter of the book. And the last chapter talks about the nature of progress. It's a pretty nuanced chapter, and their thoughts were pretty nuanced, but at the end of the day, they thought that overall humans have progressed a lot, and I completely agree with them. We started off as cavemen with spears, maybe not even with iron spears or metal spears, maybe just with wood. We hunted, we gathered, and now with so much technology, we live in such a different world. We have technology for us to really master our environment and master the world, and I don't think it's fair if you just compare happiness from back then to happiness, the level of happiness now, because happiness is very subjective. And I have seen other authors talk about how people were happier back then when life was simpler, when people were in their tight-knit communities, their tribes or villages. But I think happiness is too subjective to look at how history has progressed. I think the Durant's argument that we should measure progress as the human mastery of its environment as the more accurate way of measuring progress, and I think that is a lot more measurable, and it also makes a lot more sense, because the potential of us mastering our environment shows us how humans progress in our power over time, and our power over nature, and our power over even our own health and bodies. So back then, people died of diseases very early in life. Now people live long lives because of modern health technologies. Back then, people often starved to death, and now our agricultural technology has increased so much that people living in first world countries very, very rarely starve to death. And yes, there are cases where people do get very hungry, but compared to back then, it's nothing close. And transportation, back then you could walk or ride a horse. Now you could drive, you could take a plane. Some people could even take a rocket ship to space. So obviously humans have really mastered the environment, and I think that shows progress. It shows the increasing power of humankind. So that ends the book, and that is their conclusion, that the human race has progressed through our mastery of the earth. And I just think this book is very thought-provoking, and it offers a lot of ideas and insights for readers to think about that applies to the world we live in today, because history is really what led up to the world we live in today, and that's how we got to where we are. So it's important to understand how that happened, and it's also important to understand our heritage, because that is our cultural heritage that we are responsible for knowing and passing on to future generations. So that is my book review of The Lessons of History. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the bell notification so you get notified when new videos come out. Also, follow me on Instagram where you can DM me, and follow me on Medium where I talk about the same topics, or I write about the same topics I talk about on YouTube. Thank you, and see you next time.